Dear Professor, hello one more time. So Safar here abroad with me. This is the next series of our Silk Road Survival podcast, and today's guest is Mr. Johannes Haushofer. He's an economics professor at Cornell University. So the purpose of the project is to bring that highly academic economic knowledge to the masses. So I will briefly introduce you to our audience. So Johannes Haushofer is a Cornell economist who blends development economics with behavioral science, which is quite intriguing. He's best known for large field experiments on cash, assets, stress, and even community spillovers. So his broader topics are how poverty and psychological pressure shape everyday decisions and which policies actually change them. He founded the Busara Center in Nairobi to run world-class experiments in real markets, and co-founded Malengo, about which we will also be speaking about in the in the third part of our podcast. So to help talented students access affordable universities abroad. He also sparked the CV of Failures movement, making academia more honest about rejection. With training in both neurobiology and economics, Professor Haushofer brings lab-level rigor to questions that matter for governments, NGOs, and families. So I hope I didn't miss anything out. And
No.
The agenda today will be in the part one. We'll ask you some personal and work-related questions to get to know you and your works better. In the second part, we'll shortly focus on one of your research works, which is the short-term impact of unconditional cash transfers to the poor, experimental evidence from Kenya. And in the third part, we will wholly speak about Malengo, which is a non-government organization. I guess thanks one more time for joining, and we'll move to the part now straight ahead. So, Professor Haushofer, I wanted to ask, what first drew you to the field of economics? Was there some, let's say, open eyes moment which made you realize that economics is what you want to be doing for the rest of your life?
Okay, great question. Thanks so much for having me. It's great what you're doing here. I love this project. I remember that moment quite distinctly. I was a neuroscience PhD student in Boston and was talking to my advisor about what I wanted to do with my life, and I was realizing that neuroscience in the way that I was doing it wasn't really saving the world enough for my taste. And at the time, I was interested in studying conflict, so maybe international relations or political science or something like that. And then my advisor said, don't you think many conflicts have economic roots? And I agreed with that, and so gradually came to the realization that economics was a useful area to consider if one is interested in conflict. But then there was another train of thought that was about poverty specifically. That always seemed to be, to my mind, the biggest problem facing the world, and arguably many other problems like conflict, but also perhaps like climate change, are partly at least driven by economic factors. And so this was right around the time when the Poverty Action Lab got going at MIT. This is an outfit that runs randomized experiments in low-income settings to test which interventions work and how. And I discovered that, and that was really fascinating, that you could combine the rigor of scientific research with actually having an impact on people's lives and improving them. And so those two things together led me to conclude that I needed to study economics. And then I started taking some classes, some math and some economics classes, and ultimately did a PhD.
Pretty insightful, thank you.
Thank you so much. And my follow-up question would be about the research, why you do it, what's your primary motivation behind this, but you kind of answered this question. So I would like to ask you, do you do it like for social good, or just the stuff that you are interested in, or something else?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a deep philosophical question in there, whether when people work for the social good, it's ultimately self-serving. So to some extent, I enjoy the fact that one can have an impact with this kind of work. But I like to think that there's a significant part of the motivation that really is about the social good. I always grew up thinking that poverty was this enormous problem that we had to address, and discovering economics was a really nice moment because it has this amazing toolbox that makes it feasible to address that problem in ways that has already helped many people. I mean, not necessarily my research, although that's perhaps a small part of it as well, but many other people have done research that really has transformed people's lives in the health domain or in livelihoods areas. That's really the driving motivation, that you can durably improve people's well-being with this approach.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Thanks. So my next question would be, what meaningful activities, like it's kind of personal and really relatable to our audience. So what meaningful activities would you recommend youngsters to do in order to improve their understanding and interest in the field of economics from early on? Some unusual project or idea would be perfect, like not some research or internship, but something really unique that maybe you regret not doing in teenage years, that could have potentially set you aside among other guys also majoring in your field?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I came to economics quite late, so I don't really have, wistful thoughts about what I should have done during my teenage years. I think the trajectory that I took was good. I wouldn't have done it any other way. And I also don't know, maybe this answer is a little bit boring and conservative. I don't know whether one should sort of strive as a goal in its own right to do something extraordinary during teenage years to set oneself apart. If that happens, that's great, but I don't know if that's like its own goal. So I would say, and this again sounds a little bit cookie cutter and boring, but if someone's interested in the field, then just reading a lot is the best start. And perhaps the one thing I will say that would set someone apart from many others is getting into contact with the people who did the things that you're excited about. So if you read a book that you find fascinating, or you discover a study that you're inspired by, there's always humans behind those works, and they're often quite happy to hear from you. This is true especially when they're academics and they hear from a young student, but also authors of popular science books, I would imagine. I don't know so much about that, but definitely I can tell you that academics are very happy to hear from students. The fact that I jumped on the opportunity to talk to you is because many academics really prioritize working with the next generation. And so reaching out is something that I think doesn't come natural to many people, and you think, oh, who am I to take the time of this person? But it can be a really nice way of getting in touch with people. And I wish, that's maybe one thing I wish I would have done more of when I was younger. So for example, I spent 3 years at MIT on a fellowship where Esther Duflo, who was one of my intellectual heroes, who had co-started this movement of randomized experiments in development economics, was working. And during those 3 years, I met her a number of times that's like embarrassingly low, given that I was there and I had the access. And she even remarked at one point, like, where have you been? And I hadn't really reached out to her much because I didn't think like my questions and problems were worth her time. And so I've now learned that was wrong, and I should have done it more. And that's perhaps a lesson that I would impart to others. Don't be shy to talk to people, even if they seem, if they're very well known, and you might think they may not have time for you, even if you think your ideas aren't ready. I would default to talking to people early.
Yeah, that's a great advice. Thank you. So my question would be about the Nairobi Center, Busara Center in Nairobi, I mean, that you helped to build, and so that researchers could run high quality studies with real participants and in real markets. So what do you think, what kind of problem did you solve there, and how did that kind of change the kinds of policy questions you could credibly answer there?
I think the main problem that Busara solves or contributed to solving is the fact that much of the behavioral science that was being done at the time and still is being done today happens in what has been termed weird settings, where weird is an acronym and stands for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So basically, most of behavioral economics and psychology works with samples that are undergraduate samples at US universities. That's changing rapidly. Now it's mostly online samples, MTurk and Prolific and platforms like that, but still the point remains that these are often people who are very well off relative to the average citizen of the world. And so the impetus behind founding Busara was to broaden the horizon a little bit and make accessible populations that behavioral science wasn't working with very much, but that are much more typical of the average world citizen. And then related to that, because I was interested in development economics, there are many findings in development economics that operate through behavioral mechanisms. So people use the fact, for example, that most individuals are present biased to some degree to develop interventions that improve their life outcomes. And at the same time, it was kind of lucky that those interventions worked when applied in development settings, because the evidence on the behavioral quirks like present bias came mostly from these weird, quote unquote, samples and settings. And so another goal was to move away from having development economics be inspired by behavioral findings from rich countries to actually providing findings from the same contexts where we were interested in improving people's lives from a development economics perspective. And so I think that has worked in the sense that we now have both studies before development economics field studies that get done in the lab that motivate or provide some background information for what later becomes a field study. And we have studies in the lab that provide further evidence after
Да,
a
да.
field study has been done.
У меня сейчас урок, онлайн-урок, я камеру.
That was sort of the twin goals, to inform development economics and to broaden the perspective that behavioral economics and psychology have. And I think your second question was how it's affected, what policy questions it's made accessible. I don't think there are new ones that it's opened up, but perhaps it's made us better at designing studies in the first place. Through this first mechanism that I mentioned, we can now do some lab studies to motivate our field studies better and to understand the results of the field studies better ex post by following up with a lab study to understand mechanisms.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's pretty amazing, I would say. Like,
So yeah, I will move to the next question. So, dear professor, how do you balance the high responsibility of teaching students and writing high quality research papers? What is more important to you, teaching the already known or exploring the unknown?
I balance it very badly, like many academics, although I think I'm an outlier even there. I have a young son also who's taking a lot of time, so I'm quite stretched, as many academics are, and not always doing a good job at either. But it's really hard to answer the question which is more important. it's a little bit like asking whether the left shoe or the right shoe is more important. They're both very important, and I think they inform each other. So I learn a lot from my students, especially at the master's and PhD levels. Students ask great questions. Working with PhD students is especially rewarding because they're really the sort of sentinels. They're the ones who come up with the new questions, the new directions that they're going to take the field in. And so that's fantastic to witness. Especially as you get older as an academic, you're kind of out of the loop a little bit. You're stuck in your same old topics, and having that inspiration from the younger generation is incredibly valuable to understand where the field is going and therefore inspire your own research. And then conversely, I think having research experience and exposure makes teaching much richer. So the fact that I can not just talk about a paper that someone else has written, but I can talk a little bit about what that looks like in the field. Occasionally it's even my own papers that I talk about in lecture. I can give the background of how these things come to be and how they were situated in the landscape at the time at which they happened. I think that improves the teaching and the student experience to get like a more realistic sense of what research is like and how knowledge is created. So they're twin goals, and I wouldn't want to do one without the other. I thought about jobs for a while where I would have only done research, and that in the end I decided, academics often complain about teaching. They want to do research because research is super exciting, but in the end, when push came to shove, I actually decided that I did want the teaching element in my work because, like I said, it sort of inspires in both directions.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. So my question would be about your non-profit organization, Malengo. So you co-founded it, betting on international education as a path to big life returns. So what evidence persuaded you that this pathway delivers like a durable gains, and how do you address brain drains like concerns while keeping opportunity open?
Great questions. What evidence persuaded me was really the absence of evidence, partly. There isn't all that much rigorous empirical evidence on the impact of migration from very low income to very high income contexts. There's a few studies that show large impacts, but I wanted to write the RCT or help write the RCT that shows, RCT is randomized controlled trials, so that's the kind of study that I do, where a treatment group receives an intervention, a control group doesn't, and then we can observe what the impact of the intervention is by comparing the two. There weren't a lot of studies that did that with the kind of migration that I was interested in, so very low income to very high income. And what was there was a bunch of cross-sectional evidence and some causal evidence that showed very large impact. So if you compare income differences across countries, those are massive, right? Like on the order of 3,000 to 4,000% going from the lowest to the richest countries. And I was considering this evidence with the backdrop of having worked on cash transfers, where we give people, well, not we, but NGOs like Give Directly that I've done a bunch of work with, give people maybe $1,000 or thereabouts, and then observe their outcomes. And their incomes grow by maybe 10%, 20%, something like that over the following 1 to 5 years, perhaps. And that's minuscule if you compare it to these cross-sectional country income differences that are on the order of thousands of percent. Not 10 or 20, but like 3,000, 4,000. And so my thought was, if you can realize even a small chunk of that large cross-country difference by moving someone from one place to another or helping them move, of course they have to want to move, that could potentially be much more impactful than a cash transfer. And that has largely been borne out in the sense that there is an RCT built into the program, so we will have rigorous evidence. We don't have the final answer yet, but the preliminary results suggest that really incomes do go up a lot when students move. So the flagship program in Malengo sends students from Uganda to Germany to attend college, so to get a bachelor's degree. And because they have to fund themselves already during their studies by working part-time, the incomes that they have are much, much higher in Germany than they were back in Uganda. And this is even true once you adjust for the price differences across the two countries. So a multiple-fold income increase already while still studying, and hopefully that'll get larger once they graduate and enter the labor market. So there was that anecdotal evidence from earlier and some rigorous evidence from sort of, I guess, some RCTs and other causal identification methods, and now we're starting to have some early evidence on Malengo's impact, and that's largely confirming this ingoing hypothesis. And then the brain drain worry is a really important one. It comes up basically every time I tell someone about the program, with the exception of the beneficiaries of the program. So no Ugandan has ever worried about brain drain. We talked to representatives of the ministries and the administration, as well as to parents and students. They're not concerned about brain drain. It's Europeans and North Americans and other people from wealthy countries who are worried about brain drain. But we still have to take it seriously, obviously. The idea that if a large share of the talented young people leave a country, that could be bad for the local economy, you can't dismiss that very easily. At the same time, I think what gets overlooked is that there's a number of channels that work in the other direction. So, for example, everybody who leaves is very likely to send back remittances. We see that in much of the literature. It's true for our Malengo students. People send money back home, and to the extent that they're earning much, much more abroad than they would earn at home, that contribution can be quite large. And in fact, remittances are a very big part of the economy of many low-income countries. So that's only the first and most obvious channel, but then there are other more subtle ones. So for example, these students serve as role models for their peers, for their siblings and their friends, who might then also study harder, either to pursue a similar path and go abroad, or to achieve a higher level of educational attainment in the home country. That's been documented in some of the literature. One prominent example is incentives to invest in human capital have been shown to be higher when there's a path to emigration. So there's a famous study from the Philippines that shows that when a visa path opens for Filipino nurses to emigrate to the United States, many more people in the Philippines decide to train to be nurses, but only a relatively small share of them actually do end up leaving, which means that there are many more nurses in the Philippines. So for every one nurse that leaves, there's 9 additional nurses or something thereabouts in the Philippines. Now, that's of course only a good thing if the Philippines happens to need nurses at the time, but it illustrates the general point that it's not necessarily a net loss if educated people leave. It could lead to the net creation of more educated people. And then there's other evidence like foreign direct investment, business relationships, and so on that also contribute. So in my head, the benefits of brain gain, as it's called, vastly outweigh the potential cost of brain drain, for which there isn't all that much empirical evidence. There's a little bit, but not very convincing. And so I've answered the question for myself that even empirically, it's not a big concern. Then there's a moral question, because you can easily see how this becomes very patronizing. If you are worried about brain drain and you want to turn that into policy, it's not actually easy to do that without being quite patronizing to people. You essentially have to lock people in place. You have to tell a young Ugandan who has an opportunity to educate themselves abroad, no, you're not going, you're staying. We want you to do something here instead. And that's very condescending, very patronizing. I don't think it corresponds to the idea of personal freedom that we apply to most people in wealthy countries. But for some reason, people feel okay applying it to people in low-income countries. I think that's kind of I want to use that word carefully, but it's not very different from the kind of patronization that happened during colonial times, where people are told what's good for them. And so I have a strong moral objection to brain drain once it gets turned into a policy that's place-based and keeps people trapped where they are.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you for sharing.
Yup. Very insightful, Professor. So my last question for the part one would be, looking forward, what big questions in economics truly excite you?
Great question. So perhaps again a little bit boring. The question that's driven me my whole career is still not really answered. It's how do we get rid of extreme poverty once and for all? There have been enormous strides over the past couple of decades through a mix of business development and government action and nonprofit organizations and individual citizens, of course, working really hard and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. But there's still an enormous problem. There's many, many millions of people who are living in extreme poverty, and that's, in my mind, like I mentioned at the beginning, one of the biggest problems facing the world, and arguably many other problems are consequences of that. And I don't think we have a good answer to that question yet. There's many small answers, but which of those we should apply at any given moment, whether there are others that perhaps we've overlooked. My answer has been migration in the last couple of years. I want to explore how far we can get with that. But there might be others that we're not seeing yet. That's my big question still. And I'm very excited to see what the new generation like you guys will bring to the table in answering that question.
We'll definitely try to, I guess. The field is interesting, honestly. And there is a lot of to explore more. So I guess we can move to the part two. It will be a brief discussion of one of your research papers, which is the short-term impact of unconditional cash transfers to the poor, experimental evidence from Kenya. So I will briefly present the work, the context, and the findings, and then we'll move on to the questions. So in rural Kenya, researchers tested unconditional cash, no strings attached, sent by mobile money to very poor households. So transfers were sizable by local standards and varied from roughly $400 PPP, which is purchasing power parity, for the standard program with a larger 1.5K PPP version in some arms, paid either as a lump sum or monthly, so like during certain periods, and sent to husbands or wives. 9 months in, households raised monthly spending from about $158 to $193 without meaningful increases in alcohol or tobacco. This part is quite interesting. And built assets, for example, metal roofs for their houses, while reporting less stress and higher life satisfaction. So monthly payments were passed for food security, while lump sums helped families make bigger purchases based on the evidence of savings and credit constraints. So most results didn't hinge on whether the man or the woman was receiving the cash, and also, the bottom line here is that free, well-targeted cash quickly improves living standards, and the payment design steers gains toward either steady consumption or investment without any bad habits, without any increase in bad habits. So I hope I didn't miss any part out, and we can now move to the questions. So, Professor Haushofer, what first motivated you to study unconditional cash transfers in rural Kenya, and that convinced you this question mattered?
That was a great summary that you gave. It's a good reminder for me as well because the study was a long time ago. I originally actually had a scientific question that led me to this general area, which was the relationship between psychological well-being and stress specifically, and income. And so from that perspective, the cash transfers were really only a tool to answer that scientific question. You want some exogenous, some randomly allocated increase or decrease in income. This is an increase, of course, to understand how that affects psychological well-being. So there was a scientific question for which this was the perfect setting. But then, of course, cash transfers are super interesting and important in their own right as a poverty alleviation tool. And they were gaining prominence at the time when we started this work. There was a group of graduate students at Harvard and MIT that founded this NGO called Give Directly that I ended up working with. And the purpose of this NGO is to collect donations from folks in high-income countries and send them directly as cash to the mobile phones of people in low-income countries. And that was, for me, the perfect scientific setting, but it was also an interesting study, intervention to study in its own right. It wasn't the first time that cash transfers had been tried. There have been other times in history, but this was a cool new incarnation that set it up as an NGO that anybody could donate to. And yeah, it seemed like one additional puzzle piece in this big question that I mentioned earlier: what's the best way of alleviating poverty? You know, historically, people had given all sorts of answers to this question. Microfinance was a big answer for a while, and then we learned that that has some positive effects, but they're not fully transformative of people's lives. It's not like you shoot someone off into orbit and then they never look back and they're now a part of the middle class. They're still relatively poor. We're now learning that that's true for cash transfers as well. They're perhaps not the right tool to really lift people out of poverty very durably and very dramatically. That's why I ended up thinking about migration. But it's a really great intervention, and at the time that was sort of the new answer that many people gave. Okay, we've tried savings, we've tried microfinance, now let's try just giving people cash, no strings attached. And so it was a contribution to that conversation to do that study.
Thanks a lot. So my second question about the work would be, why those transfer sizes? I mean, $400 PPP standard and $1,500 PPP large, and that 9 months window. Also the question, why? Why not more? Why not less? And what real-world policy did you have in mind about this?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is probably quite disappointing, because it's, it wasn't really based on much. And you should, the right people to ask are the Give Directly founders, but my memory is that the original idea was $1. These are people who are living on $1 a day. So let's give everybody $1 a day to, definitionally get them above that $1 a day line, or a bit beyond that ideally. So I think the $400 is like the purchasing power parity adjusted version of 300 something. I think nominally it was 300 that was given, and I think the idea was to be close to the $1 a day. So it wasn't much deeper than that, I think, partly because there isn't really still, in fact, but certainly at the time, there wasn't much evidence on what the right transfer size is, and so it was kind of guesses in the dark. Same for the large amount, that was, as far as I can tell, largely driven by the idea that $1,000 seems like a good amount, and when you purchasing power parity adjusted becomes $1,500. But I think it was nominally 1,000, and so that just seems like a focal number, and not a horrible thing to do. And so I think that's the real history of how these amounts came to be. Then of course you can ask, what's the right amount once we have the evidence on what the amounts do? What should the amount be, and how long should it be delivered for? And that goes to the 9-month question that you asked. And in our work, there wasn't all that much difference in terms of the percentage increase in the amount relative to the percentage increase in the treatment effect. So if you increase the amount by 100%, treatment effects roughly double. Perhaps a little bit less than double. So there is some what we would call concavity. That curve flattens off a little bit, but not much in our hands. To the extent that you believe that it does flatten off a little bit, that would be an argument against for making relatively smaller transfers. the counter argument is that when we give people these lump sums, or give directly rather, they have an easier time investing in large assets, and that could be a good thing longer term if they have now business assets like cows, for example, agricultural assets that improve their lives. And so I would say we don't have a super clear answer on what the right amount is. Larger amounts are better, but there's a trade-off, of course. You can help more people with the same amount of money if you make them smaller. And so you probably want to land somewhere in the middle. And in terms of the duration, it's a similar trade-off, right? Like if you give streams, as you mentioned, then you can do it for longer, and you will tend to increase consumption more than anything else. If you give lump sums, you can do that, I mean, definitionally once or a few times, perhaps, if you want to make it a sort of truncated stream. You tend to generate impacts on asset ownership more than on consumption. So like I mentioned, people buy cows, and I would say that's the main consideration when it comes to deciding how long the transfers should last.
Got it. So my next question would be quite intriguing, I would say. So giving to wives versus husbands, how will change economic outcomes? Why do you think is that, and what does it reveal about household dynamics?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I don't want to push that point too hard because, as you say, in our study, there weren't differences in terms of how money was spent when it went to the wife versus the husband, which was randomized. Our sample was relatively small, and so we can't reject, moderately sized differences in spending. And directionally, they do look a little bit different. Like wives tend to spend more on health and education, and husbands perhaps a bit more on business activities, and other studies have shown larger differences. The degree to which you want to take it seriously that we don't find differences, to the degree that you don't want to take that seriously, that you do want to take that seriously, sorry. It could be because households are unitary, so they're making decisions together. They talk about what they need, what's good for the household, and then that doesn't change much whether the money comes in through the wife or through the husband. An alternative and much less pleasant story is that it's really one person who makes the decisions, and the other person isn't consulted much. So like in the stereotypical case, it could be that the husband simply appropriates the money regardless of whether it comes to him or to the wife, and he makes the decisions. We can't distinguish between those stories. I'd like to think that the former is true, but there are probably places and households where the latter also happens. But again, I don't want to push this lack of difference too hard, because I think if you look at the balance of the evidence, there probably are some differences in spending where women are a bit more likely to spend on health, education, husbands on businesses.
Thanks a lot. So my last question, would be kind of answer the second one. So if you check up on these people after 10 years, do you think a lot would change?
I think I heard that. I think somebody's vacuuming where you are, Sam. You're asking about the 10-year effects, what the effects change. So we have gone back, and other people have done much better jobs of going back, and the effects definitely decrease over time. So one of the things that brought me to this migration topic that we've touched on earlier, and I guess we'll talk about more, is precisely the fact that the impacts of cash transfers aren't super long lasting. And initially it even looked like they completely went away. Like in our hands, in the early follow-ups, there were asset results left, but everything else had kind of gone back to zero in terms of comparisons to the control group. Now we're learning that there are some longer term effects that are positive. There's even evidence now from Ted Miguel and colleagues on mortality benefits, which is really amazing. So they do good things even long term, but how large those effects are, we don't know yet. And it certainly does seem true that they decrease dramatically over time. Which is not to like rain on the parade of cash transfers. Like it's, of course, the original hope that perhaps they would lift people out of poverty once and for all, like they get you out of a trap, and then you go on a trajectory where your income is durably much higher. It's unlikely that that's true, but if some outcomes are better in the long run, that's still great. And even if that wasn't the case, having a better life for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, that's still fantastic, and better than many other interventions can achieve, which don't deliver many gains at all.
Got it. So thanks a lot. That's all for the part 2. Now we can move to the part 3. So it will be a discussion about your NGO, Malengo, and it was quite interesting for us, especially for me, because I'm learning the German language now, and this NGO basically works with Germany and higher education in there. So yeah, I will give the micro to Paul, I guess.
Yes, sure. So we briefly talked about your motivations behind creating this NGO, right? So how about we talk about some statistics, maybe numbers. Why did you choose Germany as a place to study students, and also maybe some statistics on successful cases or the current situation of your non-profit organization? Yeah.
Right. So Germany was chosen because of all the countries that we screened, it provides the best environment for this kind of program, starting with the fact that university studies are free. So there's no tuition fees for anybody, regardless of where they come from. This is not just true for German citizens or EU citizens, but it's true for anybody in the world. If you get into a German university, there are no tuition fees. That's amazing and makes the program much more affordable. Combined with the fact that there are now many undergraduate programs that are taught in English, so you don't actually have to speak German to participate, that makes it a really attractive place. And then finally, there's a really, booming is perhaps too strong a word, but there's a solid labor market that has a massive shortage of skilled young people, especially in technical occupations, STEM kind of occupations. And so those factors together make Germany super attractive as a destination. And so then on the sending country side, Germany doesn't recognize all the high school degrees in the world for university entry, but they do recognize a bunch of African ones, and Uganda is one of them. So Uganda is very, very low income, has a very good education system, and the high school degree qualifies for university entry in Germany, and so that's how that combination came about. And in terms of statistics and how students are doing, we currently have about 250 students who are part of that program, University Uganda to Germany. We have another 250 or so who are part of a new program that provides TVET, so technical and vocational education and training. This is essentially nursing and a bunch of green jobs, so installing solar panels, electricians, and so on. So those are not university studies. They're vocational trainings that last for between 2 and 3 years and are done in collaboration between a school and an employer. So the big advantage of that setting is that you're earning an income already while you're still being trained. Not a high income, but enough to survive. And so the downside is in that program you have to speak German already. And so people are now training to get to a certain German level in the home country, and then hopefully they'll depart for Germany. This is also in Germany, which has this very robust TVET system, once they know enough German. So there's about 500 students or so altogether, the university students are all still in Germany, except for like a very small number of cases, and making progress in their studies. Slower in many cases than what we would have hoped, but still progressing slowly to graduation. There's some really nice examples of people doing very well. So we have the first graduate in our bachelor program now who just finished his studies and is now continuing on to a master's degree. There's one student who got into medical school, even though that's not something that we offer because it's only taught in German, but he actually managed to get to the required German level in a short amount of time and then got a spot to study medicine. So that's very inspiring to see. And yeah, more broadly, they're doing fine. There's always ups and downs where, it's a tough situation that we're putting them in. They need to deal with a new environment, learn the language, study, work on the side. It's a very demanding situation. And so, there's a lot of psychosocial support that we're having to do, mental health management and so on. But so far so good. It's mostly working, I think.
Yes, that's so inspiring to hear. You have a great vision, and I appreciate it. But how about talking about future plans? How would you say? Would you continue to invest in this project, or maybe you have something different to make about that?
I definitely still want to invest in this project. The future plans are stupidly ambitious. I think there's, the limits to how large this could get in principle are actually pretty large. So if you look at how many students there might be in low-income settings that might want to take advantage of an opportunity like that, it's in the hundreds of thousands or maybe millions. If you look at how many opportunities there are, it's actually also very large. Many industrialized countries need young people because their populations are aging, and to support the pension systems, they need workers. And all over Europe and other high-income countries, there's a massive shortage of workers, especially in technical occupations. And so I think the opportunities are not limitless, but vast. And I really want to grow this program as large as we can possibly make it. And we've now started with the two extremes of the scale. So a very, very low-income country to a very, very high-income country. But that's not the only migration that's beneficial. So gradually I want to sort of fill in the space in between to the point where, somebody who wants to go from Uganda to Kenya can also do that. So it doesn't always have to be super low income to super high income. I think there's a huge opportunity also with other kinds of migration. So the ambition, as you can tell, is ridiculously unbounded, and I'm really excited to see what we can do.
Yeah, definitely.
We would highly appreciate if you could take Uzbekistan as well. There are lots of potential users.
We should talk about that. I mean, you guys have a very solid secondary education system. I think that they actually
Got it, yes. We could talk about something else if Safar has some suggestions, but
Sure. I have questions about the Malengo. So it will be a little like economics here. So about the financing logic of the project. So why do you think an income-based contribution instead of loans or full grants? So what makes it fair in practice for low volatile early incomes?
That's a great question. And maybe for the benefit of the listeners, I'll briefly explain the financing model. You've said it correctly. It's an income share agreement. So we give money to students, and then later, once they have a job that pays them a certain income above a threshold that we define, so enough to get by, at that point, we start asking the students to repay a share of their income. And so the fact that it's a share, that's why it's called an income share agreement. But that makes it fair to the student in the sense that they're not asked to pay an installment that's independent of their income, as would be the case in a loan. And so that installment could be very high relative to your income. The fact that for us it's always a proportion means that it goes up and down in absolute terms as your income gets higher. And so that's really nice for the student because they don't have to worry about whether they're making an income at all, and if they're making an income, how high that income is. If they're going to be able to afford the payment, they're always going to be able to afford it because it's just a proportion. So that's the logic behind it. And I think it's a really nice model for this particular program because students don't have a good sense, I think, in the beginning of how successful they're going to be. So if you imagine the situation where they take on a loan, where 3 years later, 5 years later, they know that they have certain installments that they have to pay, regardless of whether they're successful or not, regardless of whether they have a job or not. That's really daunting. And you could definitely see a student shying away from that opportunity because they're worried that they're going to be in trouble if they don't succeed at university and then don't have a high enough income to serve the loan. So an income share agreement relieves the student of all of that pressure. Of course, there's still plenty of homemade pressure that our students put themselves under. They want to succeed, but there's not that outside need to succeed because you need to pay an installment. Related to that is the fact that when you have a loan, you might be forced to make certain life choices. So for example, you might have to start working rather than continuing to a master's degree or to a PhD in order to serve your loan. So income share agreements get you out of that problem, and I think that makes them super attractive.
Thanks a lot. So yeah, that's basically it, I guess. By the way, like, what's in there for you in Malengo? Like, do you make any money from it, or is it just like pure passion to help others?
No, it's a non-profit, and so
A
originally,
non-profit.
yeah. The idea was that I wanted to, I wanted this to be my next research project. Like, I wanted to write the paper that says, look, if you facilitate migration, you can materialize 3,000% income gains or whatever it may be. Now, there is still research being done at Malengo. Because I run the organization, I'm actually staying out of the research so that we don't introduce my own bias. Like, Malengo is my baby, and so I might be unconsciously biased and try to push the conclusions in my favorite direction. That might happen even if I try to resist it. So I'm not part of the research. But yeah, it's a nonprofit organization. Everything is under a US 501c3. There is a for-profit model built into it in the following sense. Because these income share agreements generate repayments from the students, if we have a philanthropic pot of money, we can give that to the students, and then any repayments come back to us, the nonprofit, and go to future generations of students. But if an investor wants to make money available that we can give to the students and that comes back, then that can go back to the investor. And so we do have investors who are earning, hopefully once our repayments start kicking in earnest, some percentage of returns on their investments. That could be a way for them to diversify their portfolio and still have some returns. So there is it is a nonprofit on the whole, but there is an opportunity in there for people who want to earn a little bit of a return to invest and support the students, at the same time get a return.
One more question here. So, do the students repay the exact sum that they took from you, or like, are there any percentages that are added up to that?
Right. Yeah, that's one of the interesting consequences of the income share agreement, is actually almost entirely decoupled. How much you get from us and how much you repay. Which sounds a little bit weird, but of course we calculate the repayment rate such that it roughly comes out to a fair interest rate under assumptions about what share of people are going to get jobs and what incomes they're going to make. But if you look at like an individual student's income share agreement, there isn't like a fixed amount that they need to repay. The one sense in which the money that they get up front is contained in there is that there's a cap. So they never make repayments that exceed some multiple 2.5 or 3 times of what they received from Malengo in the first place. So that's to protect the super successful people. If you go through the program and you have a really, really high paying job and you pay a percentage, that could conceivably be many multiples of what you received. And to protect against that, we have that maximum lifetime repayment amount. But otherwise it's decoupled. It's the percentage of your income rather than a principal plus interest, which would be the case in a loan.
Got it. So yeah, that's basically it. Thanks a lot one more time, Professor Haushofer. It was a real pleasure to meet with you and to speak about your research work and about your passions. So yes, we don't have any other questions except for the feedback. So could you give us some? We're open to criticism, by the way, about the podcast. Like, I don't know, maybe we spoke not right or something.
I think you guys did a great job. I love what you're doing. It's so cool. You noticed from my email response time that I was very excited to get your message. Keep doing what you're doing. This is fantastic. And my understanding is you put it on social media, right? Like this video will be visible.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great service to your peers and even like to the world, right? Like anybody can watch these videos. That's really great. And the fact that you like look at people's work beforehand, you were really well prepared, you had seen the papers, that's really great. Yeah, just try to be in a quieter place next time, but other than that, no criticism.
Yes.
Sure. We'll try to definitely. So yes, thanks a lot one more time for your time and for your contribution. We really do appreciate that, dear professor. So
My pleasure.
goodbye.
Goodbye.
Okay, thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
Goodbye. Have a good rest of your day.